Maria Perez was found dead in her kitchen. 2 weeks later, her 21-year-old daughter Elena shocked everyone by marrying Daniel, the man who had been her stepfather. Just 3 months later, Elena's body was discovered in the woods behind their home. What began as a tragic family loss unraveled into one of the most chilling cases of greed, control, and betrayal the town had ever seen. The Perez family had always seemed like the picture of stability to those who lived nearby. Their modest suburban home sat on a quiet tree-lined street where neighbors exchanged friendly waves and children played until sunset. Maria Perez, the mother of the household, was admired for her kindness and energy. She volunteered at the local church, kept her garden vibrant, and never missed a chance to cheer for her daughter Elena at school events. Elena, only 21, was at the start of adulthood, filled with dreams of becoming a teacher and eager to explore life beyond the small town. Their lives appeared steady, ordinary, and safe. That illusion shattered one late evening when Maria collapsed suddenly in the kitchen. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. The cause was listed as a heart attack. To those who knew her, the news was both shocking and puzzling. Maria had no history of heart problems, and only days before her death she had been seen laughing and chatting with friends, appearing perfectly healthy. The community mourned her loss, but the deepest grief was carried by Elena. Losing her mother so young left her shattered, vulnerable, and searching for comfort. Daniel, Maria's husband and Elena's stepfather, positioned himself as the one to provide that comfort. He had married Maria when Elena was a teenager, and though their relationship had never been particularly warm, he suddenly stepped into the role of protector. Neighbors noticed how Elena clung to him during the funeral, her eyes red and swollen, her body leaning on his as though he were her only anchor in the storm. Daniel, in contrast, seemed composed, almost too composed for a grieving widower. While tears filled Elena's eyes, his expression remained steady, controlled, as though he were thinking ahead rather than grieving the present loss. What no one could have anticipated was how quickly the tragedy would be overshadowed by something even more shocking. Barely 2 weeks after Maria's burial, invitations were whispered about, then confirmed by stunned relatives. Daniel and Elena were married. The ceremony was small, almost secretive, held without the presence of most family members. Those who attended described the scene as eerie. Elena, dressed in white, looked pale and fragile, as though the weight of her mother's absence pressed heavily on her shoulders. Daniel, standing tall beside her, appeared satisfied, calm, even proud, while whispers of disbelief rippled through the guests. How could a daughter marry the man who had once been her stepfather, and why so soon after Maria's death? Some neighbors rationalized it as grief pushing two lonely people together. Others murmured that Daniel had always had a strange control over Elena, a way of speaking that left her subdued. Family members who objected were shut out, told they should respect Elena's decision. From the outside, the marriage looked less like a love story and more like a union shrouded in secrecy, suspicion, and a sense that something was terribly wrong. The once ordinary Perez household had become a place of gossip, unease, and questions that no one dared ask aloud. It was the beginning of a story that would soon unfold into something darker than anyone could have imagined. Elena's marriage to Daniel changed everything about her once bright existence. At first glance, she seemed to convince herself that it was the right choice, that love could grow from tragedy. Yet those who knew her best could see the difference almost immediately. Her laughter, which used to ring out freely, grew quiet. She stopped visiting her closest friends, ignoring their calls and canceling plans with excuses that felt rehearsed. Even her social media, once filled with light-hearted photos and optimistic quotes, fell silent. Slowly, Elena began to disappear from the world she had once been so eager to embrace. Daniel thrived in the shadows of their unusual union. He presented himself as a caring husband, but underneath that image lurked control. He dictated how Elena dressed, discouraging her from wearing bright colors she once loved. He persuaded her to cut ties with friends who questioned their relationship, calling them a bad influence. When family members reached out, Elena's replies became short and distant, almost as if someone else had written them for her. Daniel kept her close, isolating her from anyone who might notice the cracks forming behind their closed doors. Neighbors started to whisper when they noticed signs of tension in the house. Raised voices would sometimes escape through the open windows on warm evenings, sharp and angry, quickly followed by silence. On several occasions, Elena was seen outside wearing long, sleeved shirts in the middle of summer, her eyes downcast when someone greeted her. A few observant neighbors caught sight of faint bruises on her arms and wrists. When asked, Elena brushed them off with a nervous smile, claiming clumsiness or accidents. Daniel always dismissed any concern with a laugh, assuring others she was fine, but unease lingered in the air. What unsettled people most was the way Daniel behaved in public. He carried himself with a calm confidence that never seemed to falter, often speaking for Elena, answering questions before she could open her mouth. If she did speak, her voice was softer than before, hesitant, as though she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Friends who had once described Elena as warm and outspoken now barely recognized her. She seemed diminished, almost as though a shadow had settled over her spirit. The whispers about Maria's sudden death began to resurface. It no longer seemed like a tragic coincidence that a healthy woman in her 40s could die so suddenly. People began connecting the dots. Maria's unexpected passing, the rapid marriage between her widowed husband and her daughter, and the visible unhappiness etched on Elena's face. The timeline felt unnatural, almost staged. Even Elena herself seemed torn between loyalty and fear. There were fleeting moments when she appeared unsettled by her choices, moments when her eyes betrayed a silent cry for help. Yet the bond to Daniel, whether out of manipulation, fear, or misplaced love, held her tightly in place. To those watching from the outside, it seemed only a matter of time before something far more tragic would occur. The sense of dread that hung over the Perez home grew heavier with each passing day, as though the walls themselves were keeping a dangerous secret. 2 months after the wedding, Elena's presence in the neighborhood had almost completely vanished. The once lively young woman who used to wave at children playing outside was now rarely seen. When she did appear, she moved quickly, her face pale and withdrawn. Then one weekend she disappeared altogether. Days passed without a single sighting. Daniel told anyone who asked that Elena had gone to visit a friend in another town, but his explanation lacked detail. He could not name the friend, nor explain why she had left so suddenly without taking her phone or belongings. Neighbors grew uneasy, sensing that something was terribly wrong. The search for Elena began when her cousin, worried about her absence, contacted the police. Officers visited the Perez home, where Daniel repeated his story with calm confidence, insisting that Elena needed space. Yet something about his demeanor struck investigators as odd. He showed no signs of worry, no urgency to find his young wife, and no interest in cooperating beyond the bare minimum. While police initially treated the case as a missing persons investigation, the atmosphere shifted dramatically when a grim discovery was made. 2 days after she was reported missing, a jogger in the wooded area behind the Perez house stumbled upon a body partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and branches. It was Elena. The young bride was lying face up, her skin pale and lifeless, her hands marked with deep scratches and bruises. The autopsy later revealed that she had been strangled, and the defensive wounds on her hands and arms confirmed she had fought desperately in her final moments. Her death was ruled a homicide. The news of Elena's murder shook the entire community. People who had once whispered about the strangeness of her marriage now spoke openly about their suspicions. The story spread quickly. A stepfather turned husband, a young bride isolated from her friends, and now her lifeless body discovered so close to the very home where she had once felt safe. The once quiet suburban street became crowded with reporters, cameras, and onlookers. The Perez house, which had blended into the neighborhood for years, was now at the center of a horrifying crime scene. Investigators immediately turned their attention to Daniel. His account of Elena leaving to visit a friend was contradicted by the evidence. Her purse, identification, and phone were all found inside the house. Even more suspicious, neighbors reported seeing Daniel late at night, dragging something heavy across the yard days before the discovery of Elena's body. His calm, emotionless behavior only fueled suspicion. While most husbands in such circumstances might collapse in grief or demand justice, Daniel appeared detached, as though Elena's death were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. The autopsy added another layer of unease. Elena's time of death suggested she had been killed within hours of Daniel's claim that she had left the house. The scratches on her neck were clear signs of a struggle, her final desperate attempt to survive. Police now had no doubt that she had been murdered deliberately, and every piece of evidence pointed back to the man who had been closest to her. The case that had begun as whispers about a strange marriage had now become something much darker. Elena's tragic death was no longer a mystery of absence, but a chilling homicide that left the community asking one question: had the nightmare begun even earlier, with her mother's sudden and suspicious death? As police dug deeper into Elena's murder, they began retracing the timeline of events leading up to her death. The story of Maria's sudden passing 2 months earlier could no longer be ignored. Maria had been declared dead from a heart attack, but the details surrounding her death now seemed suspiciously convenient for Daniel. Investigators requested access to her medical records and ordered toxicology tests on preserved samples from her autopsy. What they found would change the course of the case. Traces of a toxic substance, one not commonly associated with natural illness, were discovered in her system. Maria's death, once written off as a natural tragedy, was now reclassified as suspicious. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. People who had attended Maria's funeral began to remember odd details. Some recalled that Daniel had refused to allow a full post-mortem examination, insisting that his wife's death was natural and that the family had already suffered enough. Others remembered how quickly he had handled the insurance paperwork, collecting a large payout within weeks. At the time, no one had questioned it. Grief was supposed to be private, and Daniel had kept his composure in a way that seemed admirable. Now, in light of Elena's murder, that composure appeared chilling. Investigators uncovered financial motives that painted Daniel in an even darker light. Shortly after Maria's death, he had deposited a substantial sum of money from her life insurance policy. Within days of marrying Elena, he persuaded her to sign documents transferring ownership of her late mother's property into his name. What had seemed like a grieving man's attempt to manage family affairs was now revealed as calculated manipulation. Daniel was not simply a widower struggling to move on. He was a man systematically securing wealth and control through the women closest to him. The evidence of coercion in Elena's life became more disturbing. Bank statements showed unusual withdrawals from her account, often matching payments Daniel had made. Friends testified that Elena had confided in them about feeling trapped, though she never dared to speak openly about what was happening inside her home. She had told one cousin that she felt her stepfather, turned husband, had a grip on every aspect of her life, from her money to her movements. Those words, once dismissed as youthful confusion, now sounded like a desperate warning. The investigators built their case brick by brick, connecting Maria's suspicious death to Elena's murder. The timeline was damning. Maria died suddenly under questionable circumstances. Within 2 weeks, Daniel married her daughter. Months later, Elena was dead, strangled, and discarded like a problem solved. The pattern was unmistakable. Maria's death provided financial gain, Elena's marriage ensured property transfers, and Elena's resistance to Daniel's control ended in violence. When police confronted Daniel with the toxicology results, the financial records, and the testimonies of neighbors, his confident facade began to crack. For the first time, his calm exterior shifted into irritation and defensiveness. He denied involvement in both deaths, but the evidence against him grew too strong to ignore. The mask of respectability he had worn for years was beginning to crumble, revealing the cold and calculating man beneath. The community, once confused and sympathetic, now looked at the Perez home with horror. What had first seemed like a story of grief and an unusual marriage was unraveling into a tale of greed, control, and calculated betrayal. As investigators closed in, it became clear that Maria's death had never been the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a deadly chain of events, one that Daniel had orchestrated from the shadows. Daniel's arrest came early one morning, a quiet but decisive moment that marked the collapse of his carefully constructed facade. Police officers arrived at the Perez home, now marked with the weight of 2 deaths, and led him out in handcuffs while neighbors stood at their windows in disbelief. For months he had lived among them as though nothing was wrong, projecting calm and control, while behind closed doors tragedy had unfolded. Now, with evidence stacked against him, he was forced into the spotlight of a murder trial that would expose every secret he had tried to bury. The courtroom quickly filled with reporters, relatives, and townspeople eager to witness the outcome of the disturbing case. The prosecution laid out a timeline that was as cold as it was convincing. They showed how Maria's death had been staged to appear natural, while toxicology proved otherwise. They presented financial records that revealed Daniel's swift move to collect insurance money and seize control of the Perez property. They introduced evidence of Elena's bruises, the isolation she endured, and the financial transfers she had signed over under his persuasion. And finally, they showed the photos from the crime scene in the woods, Elena's body left abandoned, proof of a brutal end. Witnesses gave haunting testimonies. Neighbors described the raised voices, the late-night movements, and the bruises Elena tried to hide. Friends shared her growing fear, the subtle hints she dropped about feeling controlled, and her deep sense of unease in the weeks before her death. Family members recounted the shock of receiving news about Maria's sudden passing, followed almost immediately by the even more shocking announcement of Elena's marriage. Each testimony added another layer to the picture of Daniel as a man driven not by grief or love, but by greed and control. The defense struggled to cast doubt. They claimed Maria's death could have been a natural heart failure and suggested Elena's murder might have been the work of an unknown attacker. But the evidence was overwhelming. The toxic substances in Maria's system were not accidental. The bruises on Elena's body were not random. The financial motives were undeniable. Piece by piece, the image of Daniel as a grieving husband and protective stepfather was dismantled, replaced by the portrait of a manipulator willing to sacrifice the lives of those closest to him. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with their verdict, guilty on all charges. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but for Elena's surviving relatives, it could never erase the pain of losing both mother and daughter in such a twisted chain of events. The story haunted the town long after the trial ended. The Perez home stood empty, a silent reminder of the darkness that had once lived within its walls. At Elena's grave, flowers continued to appear, left by those who remembered her as a bright young woman full of promise. Her story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder that evil can sometimes wear the mask of family, and that control, when left unchecked, can turn into tragedy. The case closed with a verdict, but the echoes of betrayal, greed, and violence lingered, ensuring that the community would never forget what had happened on their quiet street.